AmericanED Radio, leading the education discussion. And now, your host, Jack Ford.
We are back on American Ed Radio, and we're delighted to have joining us now a new guest, Eugene Hickok. Eugene Hickok was one of the architects of the No Child Left Behind policy. You'll recall one of if you look at it, going back to the George W. Bush administration, it was one of the areas that the president had trumpeted as a real success. And the question now is where are we going with No Child Left Behind? Eugene Hickok also has written a recent book called Schoolhouse of Cards, an inside story of No Child Left Behind and why America needs a real education revolution. And, Gene, we're glad to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Let me start off. Let's go back to the days in the Bush administration when the notion of No Child Left Behind was sort of working its way through, was percolating up through the system. And I was always focused at it at a time when nowadays we rarely put the words of bipartisan and Washington together. There seemed to be some significant bipartisan support for this. Give us a quick, 1 minute history background, if you would, of the creation of No Child Left Behind.
Well, it was President Bush's number one domestic agenda priority. It was the first piece of legislation that was introduced in the Congress, H.R. 1, House Resolution 1. And from during the campaign through the process of writing the law, it was designed to be a bipartisan effort. So you had John Boehner, currently the Speaker of the House, at that time Chairman of the Education Committee in the House, working with Ted Kennedy, his counterpart in the Senate, a conservative Republican in the House, a very liberal Democrat in the Senate. And together they sort of made this thing happen. And I should point out, ironically, that we almost lost some of that bipartisanship as the debates were heating up and the differences were coming out. And then 9/11 happened. And one of the commitments congressional leadership made to the president was, we're going to get this done to demonstrate that the government, the Congress, is at work in spite of terrorism. And so you're right. It's maybe the last piece of bipartisan legislation in more than a decade.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I'm having a tough time thinking of anything else similar to that at all. So you put together this extraordinary collection of folks to get this done, as you mentioned, an important part of President Bush's agenda here. It gets into play. How would you as somebody who was there as part of its creation, how do you assess how it has worked since that time?
Well, I guess I have mixed reviews. I think to the great credit of all those who supported it and all those who have implemented it, the most important thing we've seen is a real focus on results. And that may sound ironic, but up until this time, most of the focus is always on spending enough money. And let me tell you, there'll never be enough money. So suddenly the discussion was, what are we getting for the money? What kind of results are there? And that's led, of course, to the emphasis on academic standards and accountability and testing. And I think one of the challenges is we test so much, and we need better, more fulsome ways to determine results. But that's the most important thing. The other thing I mentioned is a focus on the achievement gap. We've all known it's been there, but now it's impossible to close our eyes to it. And as long as that's the case, as long as we can recognize where the problems are, we need to find ways to solve those problems. Up until No Child Left Behind and other policies since then, most of American education was about the system and money, and we've tried to change that discussion a bit.
I think this segues nicely to your book, Schoolhouse of Cards, and the title suggests what I think you meant the title to suggest, which is the fragility of what's going on there. Give me your general thesis here for the book, and then we can talk about some specifics.
Well, the general thesis is that what happened with No Child Left Behind politically and in education policy was very important. It was kind of a culture shift in American education. The fact that it came out of Washington was also somewhat of a culture shift, and not necessarily a good thing. Education remains primarily a state-local function, but sometimes Washington, as a cheerleader, can do a lot to sort of change the dynamics of the conversation. But the real thesis of my book going forward is that we really need to be rethinking this whole enterprise. We tend to confuse schooling with education. Schooling is about class size and buildings and the institutional infrastructure of the school district. education begins before a child is born and goes on for a lifetime. And so what we really need to think about is how to rethink American education. We've got the talent, we've got the resources, but we seem to be stuck in an older model, and I'd like to find ways to get beyond that.
When you're looking at this idea, and the book has some very great and interesting and provocative thoughts about how we fundamentally change the notion of schooling. But my first question is, do you think, given the current political climate, I'm talking about not just Washington, but
Sure.
state and local, do we really have the capacity, do you think, to engage in the dramatic type of changes that you're suggesting we need here?
Well, it really comes down, in my opinion, to a matter of political will. Do we have people in leadership positions at the state and local and national level who are willing to invest kind of political capital to rethink this? I will say this, with technology the way it's developing, with generations now coming forward who have grown up with this technology, I think in many ways all the ingredients are there to rethink it. If we have some people who've got some creativity, some energy, and like I said, the political will. Earlier you were talking about class size in Baltimore and things like that. In reality, class size doesn't have to matter anymore. We have the technology to custom design an education for every student, no matter what number of students are in the classroom. We have the technology to redefine the idea of the classroom. So, and we have the students and more the teachers
Right.
who are more receptive to that technology. So I think we need to be about the business of being more creative.
Well, you mentioned some specifics here, talking about class size, and that we don't need to be driven anymore by the physical structure of a class size. If you had a group of willing folks sitting in front of you right now saying, look, we are ready to make changes, you tell us what you think we need to do. Give me some specifics that you would suggest to these people.
Well, the first thing I would do is I would redesign how we pay for education. I would make it more focused on families and students and less on institutions and systems. I would redefine the idea of grades and classroom and seat time and make it all based on competency, so that a 10-year-old child who demonstrates advanced competence in math or reading doesn't have to sit in a chair with other 10-year-old children who aren't there yet. It's much more student-based. It's much more informed by student achievement. I would find ways to make families engage in the education of their kids, not through public policy, but through incentives. Things like that. I certainly would think about the language we use. We talk about accountability. To me, accountability sounds like a harsh word. I talk about responsibility. I talk about students being responsible for getting their work done, parents being responsible to make sure their students do. I'd also encourage us to get beyond the classroom. It's a way of limiting our vision at a time when our vision should be boundless.
Hey, Gene, we got about a minute left here, and let me ask you sort of a button-up question, if you would, and that is, given your vast experience and the research you've done here, are you optimistic that we will indeed make the changes that you feel we need to make here?
It's very tough. I am optimistic because I'm by nature an optimist. But it's very tough because education is one of those areas that everyone has an opinion about because everyone's gone to school. But I do think, given the technology that's developing, and given the energy that's out there, and given the frustration people have, I think once you have one or two or three places that redesign or rethink what they're doing with regard to education, the possibilities are endless. But it's going to be a daunting task. I think we can do it.
Once again, the title of the book is Schoolhouse of Cards, an inside story of No Child Left Behind and Why America Needs a Real Education Revolution. If you got any interest in education, you should read the book. Gene Hickok, thank you so much, Gene, for joining. We'll look forward to talking to you again down the road.
Thanks a lot. Look forward to it.
All right, you be well.
You're watching AmericanED Radio, the leader in delivering entertaining, trusted, and empowering education information.